is to okay, there we go, is to help to encourage businesses to take a closer, more analytical look and delve into some of their policy systems and processes that may be inadvertently impacting specific groups, whether they know it or not. But I think the work that I do, again, is to help to encourage that activity, help to change some of that thought process and behavior to, again, address racial justice issues within Franklin County. Part of the Welcoming and Belonging group, I believe this group was started maybe about 4 years ago. So they had the idea of, wanting to kind of make Franklin County a more diverse space, both for residents, both for people who work here, both for people who choose to come here to get an education, those who just want to kind of be in a more quiet, more rural environment. So the Welcoming and Belonging group was formed. So outside of just attracting that group, they had an idea of how can we be more welcoming and belonging. So it's taking some work, it's taking many voices from the business community, all are participating in this work. And together we have started to make some very, very positive changes. And again, just getting business owners to take a look at their policy systems and processes. So that is my role in the Franklin County. And I know I have some of the Welcome and Belonging members on this webinar. So without further ado, I want to take this time to introduce Dr. Patricia Marshall. And I'm so thrilled to have her share some of her research and some of her extensive background around racial justice and diversity and equity inclusion work. I'm going to just save some of the good stuff. There's so many things I just want to say about her and her sincerity and her genuineness, not only around this work, but how she shows up in the community as an authentic person who genuinely cares about how the community in Franklin County and the counties that she serves, how comfortable they feel, how are they being educated, how they're being treated as individuals. And I got that, just that overall perspective from her since the day I met her. So I'm thrilled that she's agreed to be with us today. So without further ado, Dr. Patricia Marshall.
Thank you, Tracy. So I'll provide, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll provide a little bit of context about that first day you met me, which was at President Salomon Fernandez's inauguration, I think about 3 years ago now. I'm losing track of time, particularly in this Zoom environment. I know that President Salomon Fernandez is in the audience. I believe she is, or we were expecting her. I want to recognize that she has been a member of our new Undergraduate Experience Committee, and I will be talking a little bit about that very important part of our equity work today. So I want to thank her publicly as one of our presidents in the public system, and also as an important member of the community in Franklin County. So Tracy and I have stayed connected mostly through your work with the African American Female Professor Award. I've had the pleasure and honor of coming out and offering some welcoming remarks a couple of times, I think once in person and once virtually where Zoom crashed, but we figured it out eventually. So with that, if you could help me put up some PowerPoint slides, Helen, that would be great. Okay, great. So as the slide indicates, it says how to build an equity agenda, examples from the Department of Higher Education. So it's an honor to have an opportunity to speak with you, and hopefully we can have a conversation throughout this presentation about the work that we're doing at the Department of Higher Education to advance racial equity and justice. We've been doing this work for a few years now. It definitely is a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's a long-term commitment to advancing racial equity and justice, particularly at our public institutions of higher education. And I will provide a little bit of context about what that means. So my understanding from speaking with Tracy is that I will provide an overview of how we've built our equity agenda, and then we'll have time for a conversation. But as I'm presenting, because this is an example in a very specific context, I would encourage you to think about ways that the model that we've developed at the Department of Higher Education through the leadership of the Board of Higher Education. And just to give you, again, some context, the board is a group of members appointed by the governor. The Department of Higher Ed, where I work, serves as staff to that board. So we work in collaboration with our board, much like a campus president would work with a board, or a CEO at a nonprofit would work with a board. So we basically serve as staff to the Board of Higher Education and work very closely with them to advance system-wide initiatives. So I encourage you to think about ways this model might apply in your organizations, institutions, and businesses as I move through my explanation of the work we've been doing at the department. So on the next slide, slide 2, I'd like to just talk a little bit about some of today's objectives above and beyond you trying to think of the applicability of this model in your own contexts. I would like to tell you a bit about the importance of racial equity and justice work in higher education and how we have made our case to focus on racial equity using data. One of the things that we do at the Department of Higher Ed is we collect a lot of data. We collect a lot of data on our institutions. We collect a lot of data on the success of our students. So we have a lot of data, and we can really take a deep dive into what's going on with different populations that are represented at our institutions. I want to emphasize that this work is important in all spheres, but the example that I'm going to offer relates specifically to higher education, as I've already said. In other words, why did the Board of Higher Education and the Department of Higher Education make racial equity a priority? What factors led to this decision? How was that decision made? The work that we are doing also offers an example of the importance of advancing this work in a purposeful way. Like I said, we've been doing this work for a few years now. We've really been establishing the groundwork, the infrastructure to advance this work. So I would describe it as purposeful. And at times you'll see that I'm presenting a lot of information. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to try to provide a summary of the core elements of our equity agenda to help ground our conversation and to think about the applicability of these concepts in other areas. Therefore, I will spend some time telling you about how we have made this work our number one priority, our singular priority, as the commissioner says, at the department. What are the components of that, the equity agenda, and how do they all fit together? And this is a really interesting exercise for me because I've been head down working on this agenda now with colleagues, and it was kind of nice to try to summarize it and bring it together and think about a timeline of all of the work that we've been able to accomplish. And based on how we have done this work, I also want to highlight the value of analyzing internal systems to eliminate inequities, which is something that Tracy mentioned. You know, what are some of the things that we are doing to do that? So in order to achieve that objective, I will provide details related to our policy audit, which is underway right now. It's a 3-year process, and ways in which we are taking a close look at how policies can oftentimes perpetuate racial inequities when we look at the data. We have some examples of that emerged through the new undergraduate experience work as well. Finally, I will go over some of the ways in which we have prioritized racial equity and justice work at the department and how we have set the stage for a strategic planning process, specifically by setting system-wide goals. So I will share those goals with you. Establishing guiding principles, which we did as a group, and we did it after we had some professional development, which I will talk about, and creating a vision document called the New Undergraduate Experience. It was really hard for me to distill for this presentation and to summarize that work, but hopefully I can give you a flavor without taking a really deep dive into a 60-page document that is very dense and very important. Before I start on the next slide, I always think it's important to tell you who I am, what I've been doing, tell you a little bit about myself. So I'll talk a little bit about the professional piece. And I think identity is so important, and intersectionality. So I want to talk a little bit about why this work is so important to me in the larger sense, why student success is so important to me. And I will do that in just a second. But, you know, it's again, interesting. I like to put visuals on the slides instead of a lot of words. Some of my slides will have a lot of words, but this one is where I've really thought about what my career has looked like. And this orange part keeps growing right now, which is interesting. I had to really revise it and reset the pyramid. So you can see that thus far, I've spent the majority of my career in the classroom. I taught Spanish language and literature for 17 years at both public and independent institutions. So I have a lot of experience as a teacher, which helps me when I have to present things and summarize and make things make sense. And I have been in higher education administration for over a decade, which is hard to believe, serving as a department chair, an interim dean, and an associate vice president for academic affairs at Worcester State University. And I've been at the DHE for almost 6 years now, 6 years in November. The next slide, I think there might be a little animation. But before all I did that, I was a free lunch kid from rural Maine, a town with about 1,000 people. I grew up with no indoor plumbing. My mother left school when she was 14. So I was the first in my family to attend college. And my mother, my mother left school. My father had a high school diploma. I went on to Colby, very well-resourced institution, which has given me an interesting perspective. And then I went on to Brown. So for me, higher education is really about social mobility. That's one of the most important things that we do. We give folks an opportunity to move out of generational poverty, and we have a real obligation to think about equitable practices in higher education. So I think the combination of my personal and professional background have really fueled this interest that I have in student success and the passion for thinking about how systems and policies can perpetuate inequities for many students, but particularly our students, our minoritized students or students of color. So I think there's a little more animation to show you that I'm in the back row on this slide, causing a lot of trouble. I'm laughing. I don't know what was going on there, but I was having a really good time at the University of Maine, Orono, back in 1989. So the next slide talks a little bit about my role at the department. I do a lot of things. It gives you a sense of who I am and what I'm doing professionally now. I'm essentially the chief academic officer at the department, and I oversee all of this stuff: early college, honors program, veterans affairs, academic policy, which is really a very important area when it comes to moving the needle on equity. Because, for example, some of our policies around standardized testing or placement testing, our admissions standards, how we have students access higher education, these are all really important levers when we're thinking about equity. So on the next slide, this is really the foundational element of our equity agenda, and it goes back to 2018. And this is the board's vision statement, which makes achieving racial equity our singular focus. So back in December of 2018, the BHE voted to make equity the top statewide policy and performance priority for higher education. So what does this mean? I want to call your attention to the highlighted part of the statement: to significantly raise the enrollment, attainment, and long-term success outcomes among underrepresented student populations in the Commonwealth. So by focusing on equity, the board and our campuses are doubling down on their commitment to student success, committing to increase post-secondary access and opportunity for all students, but in particular students of color. So let's talk a little bit about why we have made equity our top statewide priority, policy and performance priority for public higher education. So what do I mean by public higher education? If you look at the next slide, the scope and impact of our public higher ed system in the Commonwealth is huge. We have 29 public colleges and universities that serve over 260,000 students annually. Our 15 community colleges spread throughout the state, 9 state universities, and 5 UMass campuses grant over 30,000 degrees each year and have a significant impact on the economy of the state. Why? Because the individuals who graduate from these institutions stay in the state of Massachusetts. So the decision to focus on racial equity was informed by the critical role that these institutions play in educating the citizenry of the Commonwealth. The next slide. It was also informed by critically examining performance outcomes. So making the case with data. And I think that this is something, the burning platform of the board, the leadership, and then the importance of the data. As we're going through, I'm going to highlight what I think would be applicable in other contexts. So if you look at the next slide, when we look at Massachusetts as a whole, there is much to celebrate. Our state tops the nation. We're the education state in many key education indicators. For example, we rank first in high school graduation, college enrollment, and overall college attainment. We are often referred to as the education state, like I said, and we should be proud of this accomplishment in the 4 key areas on this particular slide. However, when we look at the next slide, we notice that when we take a closer look at these indicators by race, ethnicity, and gender, it tells a very different story about Massachusetts. As you can see on this slide, the rates for high school graduation, college enrollment, public college graduation, and overall college attainment vary significantly by race, ethnicity, and gender. On the next slide, we see that white females, which I've highlighted, consistently rank at the top on all 4 indicators. But on the next slide, we see that Latinx males consistently rank at the bottom. Here you can see that only 22% of Latinx males hold a post-secondary degree. If we look at the next slide, we know that the disparities are large, and the percentage point gaps between white females and their Latino male counterparts become increasingly larger as we move across the education continuum, with the largest gap to the far right. Note the 43 percentage point gap between white females and Latinx males when it comes to overall college attainment. The next slide, who is going to college? When we look at trend data, we see that these disparities have been persistent over time. The next slide shows that college enrollment rates for Latinx males are trending downward. But these next slides are what's really important, I think, because when we talk about the case that I'm making, some people will tend to talk about causation and correlation. So we decided to take a closer look at socioeconomic status, SES. And we've noticed that even among students of similar socioeconomic status, racial disparities still remain. So on the next slide, we see that within the Pell-eligible and non-Pell-eligible populations, there are significant racial disparities between subgroups. The metric is overall graduation rates of students who initially enroll at a Massachusetts public higher ed institution. It looks at whether they graduated anywhere within 6 years from their initial institution, another Massachusetts public, or another private, and/or an out-of-state institution. We get that from iPads. This graph shows the rate for the cohort that first enrolled in 2011. The key takeaway here is that when comparing outcomes by race within each Pell status group, you see substantial gaps between the racial subgroups, strongly suggesting that SES alone is not the issue. These data indicated that we needed to look at equity through a new lens. For years, we have focused on socioeconomic status, think Pell grants, to move the needle, hoping that this approach would float all boats. But what we see when we look at the data on low-income students is that there are still significant and unacceptable gaps based on race. We must close these gaps because it's the right thing to do. Ethically, it's the right thing to do, and because it makes economic sense to expand educational opportunity in a state where the white population is declining and other populations are growing significantly. This is the only way we will advance as a state that needs more diverse, highly educated, and engaged citizens. So we're making the commitment to put gaps based on race and ethnicity first, based on this data. I'm going to pause for a second and see if Tracy has any comments while we move to slide 19. So we've talked about burning platform, the importance of the leadership. If you could just back up one for me. Okay, we'll stay here for a second. And the importance of leadership and the importance of data. So I want to just pause and reflect on those two really big pieces of this puzzle, of this our attempts to create and advance an equity agenda, and see if you have any comments. Tracy, while I take a breath.
Well, I'm hoping that the audience might have some contributions at this point, but what I would like to have you kind of just kind of go over again. It reminded me when you said you had to have the data tell the story. So it reminded me of being in the banking world. Whenever I wanted to make a change or a suggestion, I always had to make the business case. So how relevant, how much of that change is driven by data? And is there another way to kind of incite or move that needle if the data is not always present, or it may in some cases not be as accurate? And I'm not saying that what you have presented isn't 100% accurate or up to date, but is there another way to kind of shift or influence change without data?
Absolutely. And it's a different type of data. I would say with qualitative data, surveys. So as part of the work that we're doing, we will do campus climate surveys. And this really gets to what this group is about, which is welcoming and belonging. We want to make sure that our public institutions are the most welcoming institutions in the Commonwealth to all students. And we want them to make sure that the students feel like they belong there. And I will get into some of that part, which I would characterize as the cultural part. How do you change cultures? And, the other piece is it's important to tell the story with data when you're speaking to a board and making the business case, but decisions should be data informed, not necessarily data driven. So data, it needs to be a piece of a larger puzzle from my perspective, which includes how people are feeling, productivity, morale, all of the things that the characteristics or elements that we think about when we think about positive work environments that allow people to flourish and to thrive and to contribute. So I hope that answered your question, Tracy. I do think that part of our work at the department is convincing the board, convincing with data, but I also think that you're talking about people and you're talking about whether they want to be at our institutions, and that's a really big piece of this puzzle as well. So we promote cultural change through professional development. And again, these are elements that you'll see later in the presentation. I do have some funds that I can use to help advance cultural change through the Higher Education Innovation Fund.
Wonderful. And I do have it seems how you're like speaking on the board right now, and how you reference the data is something that the board needs in order to get them to move the needle. But you did say at the beginning that I think that the commissioner, is that hierarchy?
Yes, he's my boss.
He's your boss, and he said he wanted to make this a singular focus, and I love that. And that was in your I think maybe your second slide. So how was that dialogue? How much pushback as far as making this a priority, this racial equity agenda? as far as the board thinking that there's other things that need to happen first. So how do you put racial justice as a priority when we still have business to run? We still need profits. We still need sustainability. And how does racial justice support that?
I think that's a really big question. So one of the areas where we have been engaged is the socioeconomic status piece. We know that there's a lot of overlap between socioeconomic status and outcomes for race and ethnicity. I think it's putting the stake in the ground and not wavering. I think it's, again, the commissioner saying this is our singular focus. It doesn't mean that we're not focused on other things. It means we're putting it first. So, of course, we're concerned about our Pell-eligible students, and Massachusetts is a very diverse state, right? We have rural communities where you're situated. I think it's about, and this is a challenge, trying to create the burning platform that allows everyone to somehow see themselves in the work, right? Because I think that tends to be the point where it becomes challenging to explain. But stake in the ground, this is our singular focus, not wavering from that, creating goals, creating principles, and really this infrastructure that I'm going to talk about when it comes to all of those pieces of the puzzle. I hope I answered your question. That's a big question.
I know, but you just kind of, you're so like right on point and on target for the vision and the energy and the drive as far as racial justice initiatives. When I think about disrupting and dismantling and how you stake in the ground and stand firm in making this a priority, and it doesn't mean that other things are not as important, but you still kind of keep this work up front. And I'm hoping that those are in attendance may have something to say at this point, but I just have one more thing
Sure.
that you touched on when you had those graphs with the students who are graduating, those who are getting Pell Grants versus those who are not, those who are having opportunities to actually get in college. And I believe the Latinx male fell at the bottom of that graph. So for my business owners in the community, how does that data show up in your hiring practices, in your recruitment initiatives, on your job applications, if you are looking at that kind of standard expectation and GPA and that quality of what a talented and skilled student may look like, if the majority of the students that are in class are falling below that expectation. So how does that fit in our business community, and how does that translate to them when they're recruiting and creating job descriptions?
I think that's a really important question. And, when I talk a little bit about our policy audit prompts, I think that they are general enough so that you might be able to adapt them to engage in that level of self-reflection around issues like job postings, hiring committees, and a lot of other policies, procedures, processes within your organizations and businesses. Okay, so.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the tough questions. How often do you hear that? So, achieving racial justice in Massachusetts public higher education, vision to action. So the first component of our plan, staff professional development and the development of equity principles, required that we started with ourselves. So this is a picture of all 60-something staff members at the Department of Higher Education. And this went out on Twitter, and I was searching for this picture yesterday because I thought it was a great picture of all of us after our first professional development session in December of 2019 with Dr. Sean Harper, the founder of the University of Southern California's Race and Equity Center. So we spent 2 days with Dr. Harper, one in December and one in January. Commissioner required everyone to attend this agency-wide professional development. So this goes back to the stake in the ground. This is a priority. and getting all employees on the same page about what we were talking about. So as a result of that agency-wide professional development, we created our equity principles. So professional development, making sure that all staff are looking in the same direction, core concept, and then guiding principles. What are your guiding principles as an agency, a business, an institution of higher education? So we thought it was really important to do this first because we are the system office and we can model what we want to see at our institutions across the system. So that was really the theory behind the practice. So this intensive multi-day professional development resulted in the equity principles that I'm going to share with you now on the next slide. They were established as a framework to guide our racial equity and justice work. So again, this is part of that putting the stake in the ground. What is our messaging around racial equity? So it's moving beyond that statement made by the board and making concrete what we're going to do. So racial equity is the top policy and performance priority of the Department of Higher Ed. It will be achieved when race no longer determines one's outcomes in the Massachusetts public higher education system. It must be embedded system-wide and permeate the department's structure, culture, and policies. Again, what are we doing with our own structures, policies, and culture at the department? It requires the use of asset-based language to minimize the threat of harm, deficit, and stereotype reinforcement. Asset-based language defines people by their aspirations and contributions, whether they be cultural, linguistic. I was a Spanish professor, so I'm always kind of a little more focused on making sure that students who come to our public higher education institutions who speak other languages are valued and they can see those languages in the curriculum rather than the systemic barriers and challenges they face. It requires acknowledgement, remedy, and repair of policies and practices which have excluded or created barriers. If we go to the next slide, the equity principles require that we recognize that clarity in language, goals, and measures is vital to racially equitable practices, that we must promote culturally sustainable campus climates, back to that feeling of belonging, in which all students can thrive and are regarded in the totality of their human dignity, create and cultivate an inclusive environment to encourage the support and participation of relevant stakeholders, acknowledge the experience and knowledge of people of color, and seek to engage people of color in the pursuit of racial equity in meaningful ways. Incentivize the development and support the implementation of equity-minded, evidence-based solutions. So, this kind of goes to your question earlier, Tracy, about the data piece. I think there's this component of being equity-minded that is really that we're really demonstrating through other activities that we have in place to support the equity agenda. So it's a both and, right? It's the data is important, but it's also, it's hearts and minds. And this is the hearts piece, changing the way people are looking at systems and policies and the way they're interacting with one another, whether it be microaggressions or stereotype threat. So really being mindful of those pieces as well. So the next slide, what were the goals that we set? We know that goals and measures are vital to racially equitable practices, and our performance measurement system, our PMRS, has been designed from that perspective. In May of 2020, the BHE adopted the following system-wide goals in support of the equity agenda. Number one, 60% of working age Massachusetts residents aged 25 to 64 will hold an associate's degree or higher, and an additional 10% of the population will hold a high quality credential by 2030. 43% of, number two, 43% of African American and 32% of Latinx Massachusetts residents ages 25 to 64 will hold an associate's degree or higher by 2024. And number three, increase completion rates for these populations by 12 and 13 percentage points respectively. These are huge goals. It's not so much the content of the goals, it's the importance of setting the goals. identifying where you are, your benchmark, and figuring out where you want to be and how you're going to get there. So I'm providing this as an example, but I think the major takeaway is the importance of setting goals, the guiding principles and the goals. So the next slide. Part of taking this closer look at ourselves has also included a comprehensive department-wide policy and program audit. This audit requires us to assess and examine all of our policies and initiatives and to rescind or modify those policies that create and exacerbate racial inequity. So the next slide is a high-level summary of the elements of the policy and program audit, which I've already mentioned. I guess I would add, collaborate with public institutions to inform new policy directions. So as we're doing this, we're also encouraging our public institutions to conduct policy audits. We have a roadshow basically where we take components of this presentation, particularly the policy audit prompts, and we meet with campus representatives to talk about those prompts and to help them think about ways that they would conduct their own policy audits. Address education debt owed to Black and Latinx students. We formed a DHE learning community to support cultural transformation. Again, we're walking the walk, talking the talk, whatever it is. We're doing what we believe will really move the needle, and hopefully by doing that, encouraging our institutions to do that as well. And so we will conduct the audit over a 3-year period, with this past year, which was the first year, focused on policies like admissions and placement testing that have the most impact on students. So I think on the next slide, there's a really dense slide. I don't even think I can read it, but what you see here is all of our policies and mostly policies. I think, again, I can't really read it, but if you look at, we have the division, the policy, and who's going to be doing the review. And then we have it on a schedule of 3 years. So this is just to give you an idea of how we've structured that policy audit, because it's a lot of work. I think the most important part here, though, are the sample prompts. My dog is going crazy behind me. Come here. The sample prompts, which start on the next slide. And these prompts align with our principles. So if we look at number 1, we see racial equity is the top priority. And then we have a question. Does the policy or program reflect that racial equity is the top policy and performance priority for the Department of Higher Education? So it's really asking us to go policy by policy, go back to the guiding principle, and ask ourselves a question, interrogate the work that we're doing, and whether that work is truly leading to racial equity being the top policy and performance priority. The second one, racial equity requires acknowledgement, remedy, and repair. I think this requires looking at the origin and history of the policy or program. Did the policy or program have the intention or effect of excluding or creating a barrier to students who identify as Black and or Latinx? So there have been moments where, and you'll see this a little bit later, we've been very focused on academic excellence, and academic excellence is really, really important. But sometimes that academic excellence as a concept can exclude students, going back to what Tracy said about requirements for jobs, et cetera, that, or mathematics. Mathematics is often a sorting mechanism, right? When you're looking at student achievement, and it's kind of the gold standard, whether I think it should be or not. But math is really important when it comes to barriers for students and the placement in math in particular. So we've done a lot of work in that area. But what was the origin? We have something called the Common Assessment Policy, which required us to use AccuPlacer for many years. So what was the origin? When was that put in place and why? So I think that type of questioning of policies and practices is really important. What were people thinking when they did this? And did they really understand the impact of that policy, or again, this is a policy where you can use one instrument, one high stakes test, or you can choose to use multiple measures. You can choose to put people into remedial courses and send the message as soon as they walk through the door of a college or university that they do not belong there and they're not ready to do the work. Or you can choose to use a co-requisite model where maybe students spend a little bit more time developing their skills in math, but not in a remedial setting. So again, how are we perpetuating sorting and barriers and obstacles that we put in students' way? The next, number 3, clarity in language, goals, and measures. What clear measures or goals associated with this policy might better support more equitable outcomes for Black and or Latinx students? So how are we measuring, and why are we measuring that way? The next slide, asset-based language. How could this policy or program language be reshaped to promote asset-based and inclusive language? Promoting culturally responsive campus climates. Does this policy or program have an impact on the lived experiences of prospective students, enrolled students, faculty, or staff who identify as Black and Latinx? And then cultivate an inclusive environment to encourage the support and participation of relevant stakeholders. Who was involved in the decision-making? Who was involved in the development of the policy or of whatever component you're looking at in your agency or business? Next slide. There are a lot of prompts. We're asking a lot of questions. Racial equity includes continuously conducting rigorous critical evaluation. So you don't just do this once, you keep doing it. The department must incentivize the development and support the implementation of equity-minded, evidence-based solutions. What are equity-minded, evidence-based solutions of any disparity or racial inequity in this policy? Racial equity requires budgeting. Budgeting reflects values. How might the budgeting reflected in this policy be adjusted to make real a commitment to racial equity? Okay, I'm going to pause again for some of Tracy's hard questions before I jump into the new undergraduate experience, which is another really important piece of this work and goes to the idea of the historical context within which something is created. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a document that was created back in 1989. So Tracy.
Well, how about, do you mind if we take the question from our attendees first?
Sure.
Thank you.
So this question is from Rachel Stoller. You mentioned AccuPlacer. I'm familiar with it in the context of workforce development. What is it and how is it used in the context of higher ed?
So AccuPlacer, there's a math AccuPlacer and there is a reading comprehension AccuPlacer, and there's also a Write Placer. So typically when a student arrives at one of our public colleges and universities, they're tested. So this is placement testing. So basically with a placement test, you might end up in English Composition 1 or English Composition 2, which are college level courses, or our practice prior to probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, when we started to question the impact of the use of AccuPlacer, was to put students who did not place into college level courses into developmental courses. So sometimes I did a lot of academic advising at Worcester State, and sometimes I would have to put a student based on that placement testing into 3 developmental courses out of 5. And so that was really sending the message of, you're not college level material, you're not placing into college level courses. It slowed down the progress towards graduation. So these placement tests were really identified as a systemic barrier because we were noticing who was being placed into these courses as well. And the placement practices were disproportionately impacting students of color, which made us say, wait a minute. And this was a policy that was really put in place as a reaction to this 1989 document focused on academic excellence, we started to say, well, we should create a common assessment policy. There was a lot of concern about quality of the public higher education system. So it was a way to, think about quality and excellence, but not really some other factors that we're now taking into consideration, like equity and the impact of these policies on students. So hopefully I answered that question. But it has, we've done a lot of work in this area. We created a new common assessment policy back in, I think it was 2019. I worked with my staff to create a new policy that basically told institutions that they could use multiple measures for placement. And yeah, it was kind of really challenging and taking down that structure of only using AccuPlacer to place students.
So I do have a question. I don't see any more lit up yet, but please feel free to those in the audience to submit a question or even a statement or comment if you have, or even experience. So I think the prior slide you mentioned when you're talking about analyzing and diving deep into those policies and systems. And I think 3 slides back, you had that grid where you showed who is actually going to be doing those.
Yes.
Who are those people?
They're DHE staff members. They're staff members. I would have to, can you go back a second and I'll make my screen a little bigger so I can.
Yes. So
Yeah.
These are all staff members.
They're all staff members at
Okay.
the DHE.
So my question is, are there any other levels or any other outside individuals involved in the analysis of these policies? And should there be?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Tracy. So I would say that, for example, what will happen is the results of the policy audit for admissions will most likely come forward, and they'll come forward to me and other members of the commissioner's cabinet. We'll take a look at them and we will start to think about policy changes. So I can give you a really concrete example. It's complicated, but I'll try to hone in on the use of the SAT as an admissions requirement. So for several years, we've allowed our institutions to experiment with an SAT pilot. So typically in our terminology, we talk about pilot to policy. And we should have enough data now to start thinking about what the impact is on student success. Is it making a difference? Is it somehow negatively impacting student success? So the way I envision this will be that these groups of staff will ask these questions and then they'll bring forward some ideas. We'll continue to look at it at various levels. I don't like to think so hierarchically, but through different groups of staff members, one being cabinet. Ultimately, it would be the Board of Higher Education that would have to see the data, see the rationale, and decide to change admissions policies. So I would describe it as there are several layers to the policy audit, and that there are several decision makers, much like shared governance on a campus. You wouldn't just say, well, we've done this analysis, we've decided this, and we're going to change X, Y, or Z. It would go through a process. So our process at the department, because we're relatively small, is kind of different. But I do think what you're saying about external audit, an external presence or other voices could be very helpful. And depending on capacity and expertise, I think that's a really good suggestion.
We have another question, Helen.
Sure. So this question is from Rebecca Buzansky. Can you give an example of a policy or procedure that you have changed based on the audit?
So we're in the middle of conducting the audit. I anticipate that we will make some changes around admission standards, which I just referenced. I think we'll continue to monitor the common assessment policy and the impact of the new policy that we put in place in 2019. I've been working with the Commonwealth Honors Program. So sometimes there's a parallel process going on. I work with the executive committee, and I gave them the challenge of thinking about their guidelines in these terms, because they really write those guidelines. So, we've done some work with the Commonwealth Honors Program, particularly when it comes to transfer students and the opportunity to be invited to the Commonwealth Honors Program. And this, this goes back to what are the cutoffs that we're using to allow people to have access, and are they fair? Are they equitable? So those are some of the areas that come to mind quickly that I anticipate having some movement in. Okay.
Okay, one more question before you go, and we're going to be mindful of the time. We still have about 30 minutes on this, so I think that's good time, and as long as we're doing this dialogue. So my mind and my the opportunity and the possibilities are just buzzing in my brain, because I can see the value in this concept, and I really or I'm imagining that this may be one of the only real ways, is when you say put the stake in the ground, that we're going to see some of these changes that we want to see. So I had a concern from a individual who worked at a particular college. He was responsible for the interns that went into particular businesses, but he would always say that the majority of the time, the students of color were sent back to the class or to the school because they were not adequately or prepared to take on the role. So do you see in this equity agenda how that relationship between the businesses, that intern department, and the college could be a little bit more cohesive and collaborative, and how they can, as a business, help to get that student where they need to be, rather than relying on you, teachers and professors, to ensure that their grades are where they're supposed to be before you send them out to work?
So I tend to think of these questions in terms of systems and what we can do at the department. So a few years ago, we created a new academic program approval process. And, many of these programs are already in existence, and they only have to bring new academic programs before the board. But part of the process is I work closely with a staff member to ask some really tough questions about support systems for students when they go out for these experiential learning opportunities. I've reviewed several in the last few weeks, and we keep asking, and what supports are in place to support these students when they're out on their internships? So we're really asking some tough questions, and we will not approve the programs unless they respond and unless they have a plan to support students. So I really do think that the onus is mostly on the institution of higher ed, but I don't know, Tracy, maybe there are some professional opportunities for professional development for some of these businesses that have the interns. Those would be the two quick answers. That we're working on that at the department, because we know that equitable opportunity to high impact practices like experiential learning is inequitable. I won't get into that too much, but it was part of my presentation to the board on the new undergraduate experience. And then on the other side, I think that some professional development that maybe you could organize through your organization, or help businesses and community-based organizations put in place, would be helpful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I had the opportunity of having an intern for the first time to help me through the summer months with the AFPA program. And immediately, it wasn't my thought or my kind of mindset to see what she's here to help me. So I'm going to get everything that I can out of her to help me through my next 90 days. I felt it was my responsibility to give back to her as a student. So that was my automatic thought process. It wasn't about what are your qualifications? What are your skills? What can you do for me? How much time are you going to be with me? Are you doing the job appropriately? This was a give relationship. And I really viewed that as an opportunity to continue to help the student with her education this way.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a dive into the new undergraduate experience, which for context was about a 45-minute presentation at the Academic Affairs Committee meeting. I think we're on slide 29. Yeah. So another important step in our action plan involves reimagining every aspect of the undergraduate experience. So I've been talking a little bit about quality and excellence and kind of this, this notion that diversity isn't part of quality and excellence, equity isn't part of it, but we're really making a statement that it needs to be. So in academic year 2021, we engaged campuses and external colleagues to envision a student experience that fully recognizes students' cultural wealth and that transforms teaching, learning, and all aspects of student life within an anti-racist vision. And again, this is a charge coming from the commissioner, that stake in the ground, one voice. We're really looking at this is a foundational document. I don't know how many people knew that it was a foundational document before I pulled it out of the file cabinet. I know that several years ago when I arrived at the department, I said, wow, this really needs updating. As I was reading about the miracle of word processing, I said, wow, we've come a long way since 1989. So as part of this process, we updated a framework that hadn't been changed for decades. And you can actually see the cover of the undergraduate experience, which was obviously done with a word processor. It was a 60-page report that contained 44 recommendations, and it was focused on enhancing excellence. And again, one of the examples that I typically talk about publicly is this was probably the reason why we put that common assessment policy in place. So hindsight's 2020, and now we can see the impact and the disproportionate impact of that policy on students. So I think we're on the next slide. So last December, we put together a group of over 60 stakeholders from all 29 public institutions, even the UMass Medical School. We also included external partners, such as employers, advocacy organizations, our colleagues from the K-12 sector, and we had Tia Brown McNair from the AAC&U. I think the most important part of the work was that we engaged students through 6 focus groups. So this document really reflects what the students want. And we're actually using what we call the Student Bill of Rights to organize the document, but I will get into that in just a second. So the goal was to create a new version of this foundational document that would be visionary and aspirational. We focused on redesigning systems and structures, dismantling systemic barriers, recognizing students' cultural wealth, and advancing racial equity. So again, it's taking all of these concepts and taking a document that is really important because it's making a statement about our expectations for our public higher education system and transforming it based on this focus. So the process of engaging students, which is the next slide, resulted in a Student Bill of Rights, a set of promises to our students that will frame and inform the new undergraduate experience. This preliminary Student Bill of Rights declares that students have a right to clear, accessible, and understandable financial information and affordable and predictable education costs. Welcoming, inclusive, and safe campus environments. And how do we measure that, right? Going back to your question, Tracy. Equitable access to experiential learning opportunities, those internships, in and out of the classroom. Inclusive, anti-racist, and culturally responsive curricula and pedagogies. Diverse and supportive faculty. We know that our faculty is not diverse enough. faculty and staff who are equity-minded higher education practitioners, timely and relevant pathways to graduation and employment, holding our institutions accountable for the way that we design curriculum, and also for providing opportunities for students to transition to employment and to graduate school and to careers, and a voice in the decisions that impact their education. The next slide shows some of the cross-cutting recommendations that emerged from the new work, and then I'm going to try to put all of the recommendations into some general categories. So again, racial justice is the guiding paradigm of curricular and co-curricular undergraduate experiences. Create accountability structures to ensure that racial equity and justice progress is being made at every level of the institution, setting those goals. Prioritizing the access, success, retention, persistence, and graduation of Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous, and other students of color attending our public institutions. Ensure that data is disaggregated and intersectional. Offer ongoing racial educational professional development for all members of our campus communities. Institutionalize equity-based policy and program audits. So again, pushing that work that we've been doing at the department out to our institutions. The next slide, I tried to put these into some of the main categories because again, this was a very long presentation. The new group brought forward visionary recommendations in several areas. Admissions and transfer. We know that as students enter our institutions, whether they're entering as first-time students, part-time students, transfer students, that it's bumpy, that we can do better. Developmental education. Again, we've done a lot of work. We have work to do. English language learners. We tend to see students who do not speak English as their first language as having some type of a deficit. How might we think about aligning curriculum? Maybe use co-requisite models. Again, having studied a world language and having done so in another country, I think here in the United States, sometimes we have a very unique perspective on what it means to be bilingual, although we're getting better. And credit for prior learning. So credit for prior learning, for example, giving students credit for maybe some non-credit experiences that they have. So creating those pathways, again, back to your point, Tracy, on-ramps. So non-credit programs can help to create on-ramps for students if we look at it in terms of what are the skills, what is the knowledge that the student actually has from those experiences, and how do we parlay that or translate it into credit. Equity-minded teaching, learning, and assessment. So when we look at assessment, maybe providing students more opportunity in choosing the type of assessments that they would like a faculty member to use to assess them. Professional development for faculty and staff. I keep going back to professional development. Hiring, supporting, and retaining faculty and staff of color. What can we do to make sure that our faculty and staff at all levels, we've done a lot of work with trying to diversify the teacher pipeline, because we know that our K through 12 teachers do not represent the students in their classrooms from a demographic standpoint. The co-curriculum and student support. So we've been taking a look at mental health issues. We've been taking a look at basic needs security. Are our students hungry? Are they homeless? What are the other things going on in their lives that we need to be paying attention to as they're coming into our institutions? So finally, next slide. In order to effectuate deep and lasting change, we know that we must focus on the long-term sustainability of these efforts. So you can put the stake in the ground, but how do you make sure that after the person who put the stake in the ground leaves, it's still going to move forward? And that happens a lot. How do you survive transitions of staff and leadership when it comes to these types of initiatives? To this end, we will convene and support a broad coalition of equity partners, and we will develop a 10-year strategic plan for public higher education in Massachusetts, which is the exciting work that we're doing now. We're working with a consultant. So that 10-year strategic plan will be focused on achieving racial justice and equity, and it will really be based in all of the things that you've seen here today, the policy audit, the new undergraduate experience, and all of the components of the equity agenda. So our policy and program audit, expanded data dashboards, which I didn't talk about a lot today, but again, what is the role that data is playing? And reimagining the student experience through new have set the stage for our strategic planning process, which we're launching this fall. The next slide. I like to try to pull things together. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So this slide kind of shows the major milestones thus far, and it's a summary of all the things I've talked about. You can see the 2018 vision statement by the board, that burning platform based in data. The racial equity, professional justice, the racial equity and justice professional development for staff, that was a mouthful. The racial equity principles and the statewide goals, our policy audit, the preliminary new recommendations, our vision document, kind of a manifesto. This is what we believe needs to happen. We believe that we need to focus on excellence, quality, and diversity, and all of those things work together. And again, all leading to that 10-year strategic plan. I have another visual where I've tried to like pull out the elements and be a little more general in the way I present the information. So I think that's the last slide, where again, you see, let me make my screen a little bigger so I can see the slide better. You see the board vision statement, the importance of professional development, the guiding principles and measurable goals, the policy audit and vision document, and then the strategic plan. I don't know that this accurately represents the relationship, but it was one of the smart art options that seem to work the best. So those are the elements from my standpoint of the work that we've done. And with that, I'm done with my slides, Tracy. Do we have questions?
I'm hoping so.
Or comments?
Comments, yes.
I would be really interested in takeaways. If people found this to be helpful, what you might be able to go back and apply in the context that you work in. Again, I can't see anyone, but I know you're out there.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, good.
Helen just exposed you all.
Sometimes it doesn't seem fair that you can all see me and I can't see you. Looking for names I know.
Ah, Tanisha.
Levántese.
Stacy. I would love to hear closing remarks, and this is one of the practices when we are in our welcome and belonging spaces that we like to hear from each one of you. I found that conceptually, that though she focused on higher education or education as a whole, that there are many valid ideas and processes and planning that she has put together that we can utilize in our industry and our individual workspace.
So what resonated with all of you?
Rachel, you should be able to speak now.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Marshall, for your presentation. This was excellent and just very exciting work in your department. And Tracy kind of mentioned, like, how could this work be relevant to our work regionally, which, you know, obviously it is. But also my question, which I had started to type into the Q&A and then realized I could speak, is this is a fantastic model for other departments within Massachusetts government. And, you know, I work closely with the Department of Public Health, 2 different divisions, and a little bit with the Department of Elementary and Secondary education. And it seems like every department has a different way of doing things. And I want so badly for the departments to actually collaborate with each other, and for the governor's office to come out and say, like, hey, this is a priority for our state, instead of it being done sort of piecemeal and siloed by department. So I'm just wondering if you can reflect on that, if you have any conversations within your department about, hey, like, how could we get DESE to do something like this? How could we get, the Department of Labor, when I asked the question about the AccuPlacer, I'm on the Youth Career Connections Council for our workforce board, and it would seem like, wow, this is a process that could easily be translated to the Department of Labor. So just some thoughts on how do we get the whole state to think about this?
That's a really big question.
Sorry.
I think by going out and talking about it and getting people excited, all of these departments, not all of them, but sometimes the structures are similar and sometimes they're quite different. We have a board, we have a commissioner. We're organized through the Executive Office of Education. So we're one secretariat with 3 different agencies.
Yeah.
We have Early Ed and Care, Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, and then the Department of Higher Ed. I think in Massachusetts, at least with our colleges and universities, we have a very decentralized system. There's a lot of local control. I think that from the standpoint, and I can't speak for the governor certainly, but I think you see elements of it in different agencies and different secretariats. I think that that level of coordination would be challenging, and I think it would have to be done at the secretariat level. I know that DESE is very focused on equity. I often go out and present with colleagues and with Commissioner Riley on the importance of diversifying the teacher pipeline. I think, quite frankly, we have a pretty robust and well-developed model. I don't know how replicable it would be with other state agencies because I've only worked at the Department of Higher Ed and on campuses, as you saw in my presentation. But that's a really good question and something for me to certainly think about and take back to my agency to think about.
Thank you.
What parts, again, looking at the last image that I put up, or just the components, what parts might resonate with all of you as you think about how you could apply the concepts? Or Tracy, do you have any ideas? I know you talked a little bit about when people apply to jobs and how you're looking at candidates and what you're valuing.
Yeah, the only thing that I think I would want to add, and I don't want it to diminish the contribution at this point, but when I think about racial justice initiatives, when we talk about disrupting and dismantling white dominant cultural norms, whether you're in higher education, whether you're in the nonprofit, whether you're in the financial industry, whether you're in the food services, somehow we all have to come back and connect with each other. So to kind of differentiate and separate our industries or the work that we do, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice right off the bat. And it becomes distracting, and it becomes discouraging if we cannot see how we all connect. And if one of us drop the ball in our industry, we all suffer. We're all going to pay the cost, because if students are not getting the education, our workers, our employees are not going to get the quality employees that they need. If the quality employees the employees are not getting the pay that they deserve, then our housing is going to suffer. They're not going to be able to afford to eat. So then the food pantries become overflooded, and then violence is increased. Neighborhoods suffer. This is a whole chain reaction on what happens when one industry drops the ball and we are not taking care of our constituents in every industry that is functional in our communities.
Right. I think the interconnectedness that you just described goes back to Rachel's question or comment, right, about the need to think about all of us as part of a system, and that,
Mhm.
as you said, when one part of the system isn't working, there's a ripple effect, there's an impact in other parts of the system.
Great, we need to own that. And one other thing I just want to say that I observed throughout your whole presentation, you didn't mention training one time. Why
Training?
is that important? You didn't say employee training, you didn't say staff training, you said professional development. So
Yeah.
this is something that word training is like, it's a kind of a thorn in my side that we can't really train this work. So when you talk about the professional development, I just wanted to make that observation. You
Yeah.
never once mentioned training.
Yeah, it's a developmental approach, right? I think that as an educator, that's how I tend to think about it. It's not like, I don't know, training has a lot of connotations, right?
Yes.
That it's even, I see it as education or professional development, or I think that puts the individual at the center a little bit more, and
Mhm.
choices and mindset than training does. Yeah, I tend to avoid that word.
Good for you. Good for you. And the last thing, if I am,
Got a question?
thank you, Lucy. And does she have more? Is there a question in her? I only seen a piece of it.
Yep, there's a question here.
Okay.
Has the Department of Higher Ed consulted with students of color to inform this work, or do you have plans to do that in the future?
Part of our sessions with students for the new undergraduate experience, we made sure that we had a diverse group of students, many students of color. We often engage with our student advisory council, which is the leadership from our campuses. So one of the things that I didn't mention today with that Student Bill of Rights is one idea is to have students vote on it and to send it out to all students for feedback. So yeah, that part of the work is continuing to develop. But I would say that we have thus far, to the best of our ability, tried to engage a very diverse group of students in conversations, particularly about the new undergraduate experience. So thank you for that question.
Any other questions, statements, or comments? We have 5 minutes. Well, the last thing I guess I would want to have you kind of elaborate a little bit on is you talked a little bit about accountability throughout your presentation. And I noticed that you're putting the onus on the faculty, administrators, and the staff. What is the student accountability? What is their responsibility other than their contribution to their needs and how they are experiencing their college education? But I mean it in the context of, what if they are the culprit? What if they are the ones who are actually contributing to those negative experiences for other students? How are the students held accountable?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because one of our subcommittees of the new undergraduate experience is creating student-ready colleges versus college-ready students, which is an idea that comes from the AAC&U. This is a hard question, and I think that my answer is probably more informed from years and years in the classroom, and sometimes getting frustrated with students who weren't doing what they needed to do. I do think that sometimes there are just so many factors for our students that get in the way of doing what they need to do. I do see it as shared accountability. I haven't thought a lot about that, and I think it's hard to answer that question in general terms, because it's so based on individual behavior and individual relationships that develop, whether it's in the classroom or in the internship setting that you mentioned, where they would just send the students back. Sometimes I've had to do hard things like removing students from certain types of experiences, whether it was in the classroom. Those are really hard situations where I think it's you try to make sure that the faculty and staff have the skills to help students develop and to help them do the things that they need to do and allow and create opportunities to do that. But I don't think that we can just say that students have no accountability at all. But it's just so situational for me, Tracy, because of my experience in the classroom. And sometimes being like, hey, if you don't do the work, I can't give you a grade. But you have to figure out how to motivate the students, how to inspire them. I think a lot of that can come from the faculty and staff, but not all of it. There's an intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. You have to create the conditions, and that's all you can do. You can't do it for the individual. That's a really long-winded answer, but hopefully it's helpful.
Very, very helpful. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and especially you, Dr. Marshall, for this very informative. And I know you mentioned that it would be challenging to kind of give this kind of overarching or overreaching presentation that would support all industries. But let me just say, you did a phenomenal job. And I think that we were able to kind of appreciate every point you made, though you reference higher education, that we can conceptualize it and apply it and find ways to embrace it and to transition some of your thoughts into what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's all relevant. And again, I want to thank you. And lastly, Helen, thank you for your driving. I appreciate you taking the lead with the technology. You did an amazing, amazing job. So last go around, Dr. Marshall, closing remarks, please, for us.
Thank you for inviting me, and I hope that we achieve the goals and that we set out to achieve. And it was really a good exercise for me to take what we've done at the department and to think about how it might apply to other areas, other spheres of work and industry. And so that was a really helpful exercise for me to think about that. So thank you.
Thank you. Helen, we didn't hear from you at all. You have any burning comments or closing remarks for us, please?
I appreciate everyone who was able to make it today and ask great questions. And thank you again, Dr. Marshall. This was wonderful and so rich and deep. So I really appreciate that. And thank you, Tracy, for helping to host and asking great questions as well. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else, last burning contributions to this end of our webinar? Building an equity agenda. Well, gone. Okay, Dr. Marshall, I'm hoping that this is not going to be the end. I definitely would love to collaborate with you on components of